Hello and welcome to my studio. My name is Sandrine Maugy. I am a botanical artist working in watercolours with a big passion for everything relating to paints, pigments, colour mixing. I also endeavour to run an environmentally friendly, ethical and vegan art practice. And Jackson's have just sent me their new curated set, which is a vegan watercolour set. So it comes in this beautiful black box, and in there are a lot of vegan watercolor supplies. So I'm going to unbox the materials and then I'm going to paint a couple of pictures using what's in the box, and then I'm going to tell you what I think about it. Are you ready? Let's go. This is the set. It's just arrived in the post. It's beautifully presented, nicely wrapped up. And inside, oh wow, it's a really nice box with Jackson's embossed on it. And inside are all the goodies. Right, let's have a look what's in there. This is the little Etcher mini palette. So it's a ceramic palette. Etcher is an Australian company. It's in a tin, and inside the tin is the color chart. And it's a little palette with some wells for the paints and some mixing wells as well. It's adorable. Really cute little palette. Okay, these are the paints. So that's 12 Daniel Smith paints. I'm going to make a color chart with those, and I'm going to research the different pigments that are in there. 2 brushes. One is a quill, Jackson's quill. The other one is a Jackson's kite. Number 0, which is actually quite a big brush, and number 1, a smaller one. And then we have the paper called Pressed Stonehenge. So that's a block glued on 4 sides. And I have actually never tried Stonehenge, so I'm really looking forward to trying that paper. And then there's a paper guide, Jackson's paper guide, which is going to make a very interesting read as well. That's it. So I'm going to try all those paints. I'm going to do a couple of paintings on that paper using those brushes. I'm going to put the paints in that little palette, and I will let you know how I get on. Before I start working on a painting, I am going to do a color chart of all the colors that are in the box. At first glance, there are 3 types of colors in that box. The ones that I am familiar with and that I use myself, such as Hansa Yellow Light, Pyrrole Orange, Ultramarine Blue, Rose of Ultramarine, Tallow Blue Green Shade, and Raw Umber. Then there is one that I'm familiar with, which I do not use, and I'll come back to that. That's Alizarin Crimson. And then the most exciting for me, there are some that I've never used before, and I'm going to discover them as I paint this color chart and a couple of paintings afterwards. And that's New Gamboge, Deep Scarlet, Cascade Green, Undersea Green, and Neutral Tint. So I'm going to paint a color chart with one of the brushes that are in the box, which is the Jackson's Quill in size 0. I've never used that brush before either. So painting that color chart is a good way to familiarize myself with it before I go for a real painting. So I'm going to dilute some of the color and wash it down. It's a very absorbent brush. It carries a lot of water. So that's Hansa Yellow Light, pigment PY3. It's an excellent lemon yellow, very clear, very transparent, saturated. I use it to mix my greens, and I also mix it in my shadow colors. It's a green bias yellow. Then we have a New Gamboge, which is an orange bias yellow. And I don't know New Gamboge. I use Hansa Yellow Deep for my orange bias yellow normally. New Gamboge is a mix of two pigments, PY97 and PY110. New Gamboge is a very rich yellow by the looks of it. Then Pyrrole Orange. This is a red bias orange, which I do have in my palette. Pyrrole Orange is a single pigment, PO73. An excellent pigment, light fast. Then we have Deep Scarlet. I am not familiar with this pigment, PR175. It's a very maroon red with low saturation. Then we have Alizarin Crimson, which is the original Alizarin Crimson, pigment PR83. And this is a pigment I do not use because it's fugitive. And it's the only pigment in that selection that is not light fast. It's a violet bias red, so it would mix some bright purples. But personally, I would not use it because I only use light fast pigments. Then we have Rose of Ultramarine. That's a mix as well. It's a mix of PB29, which is French Ultramarine, and PV19, which is a quinacridone color. So it is a granulating color, a beautiful purple. And because of the granulating ultramarine in it, the two pigments in it separate as it dries, so you get areas that are bluer and areas that are more magenta. Then we've got Ultramarine Blue, PB29, the classic French ultramarine. It's a variation on that pigment. Single pigment paint, transparent, light fast, beautiful pigment. I have that in my palette as well. It's a granulating pigment, so it gives quite a lot of texture. Then Tallow Blue Green Shade. Tallow Cyanine pigment, green bias blue, extremely saturated, a very strong pigment. I have that in my palette as well. Then we have Cascade Green. It's a mix of PBR7 and PB15. So PB15 is Tallow Blue Green Shade, which is this one here, and that is mixed with one of the earth colors, PBR7. It doesn't specify which one, but the purpose of which is to desaturate that blue. But because it is made with that blue, it's a green with some undertones of blue in it. Then we have another green, Undersea Green. So it's made of PB29, which is the French ultramarine we have here, PO48, which is a quinacridone pigment, quinacridone burnt orange, and PY150, which is a yellow. So a mix of three different pigments. Because PB29 ultramarine is a violet bias blue, not a green bias blue, it makes some muted greens, especially mixed with PO48, which is very orange. So this is a very, very muted green. And because PB29 is granulating, this is also going to separate and granulate as it dries. Then we've got Raw Umber, which is a green bias brown, one of the earth colors, and I do have that one in my palette. I use it a lot, I'm quite familiar with it. It's a very clean brown with a little bit of texture, transparent. And then we have Neutral Tint, which is a ready-made grey black. So it has a black pigment in it and a quinacridone, and again that PB15 tallow blue. I don't have that in my palette because I don't use black pigments, but that's because my art is more orientated towards flower painting, botanical art. I don't think black pigments are suitable for that, but for a landscape painter or an animal painter, wildlife artist, the black pigment that is in this one, which is PBK6, is absolutely fine. It's very luminous black. Now with those colors, I am going to paint this leaf. And I've chosen this leaf because it's got quite a few of the colors that are in that palette. So I have put those colors in this little etcher palette here. And I've got a mixing palette that comes in the same little set. And I have poured here some Hansa Yellow Light for the underneath color, New Gamboge for the richer yellow, Deep Scarlet for the muted red color that I have on here, Cascade Green, which is a little bit bluer than the green I have on here, but because the green I have on here is going to layer with the yellow, it will balance the blueness of Cascade Green. And I also have Raw Umber for the veins and some of the blemishes. So I'm going to paint wet in wet, and I'm using the Jackson's quill brush, and I'm going to start with the Hansa Yellow Light. So I'm going to go, it's an underlayer for the whole leaf, slightly unevenly because I want this to mix with the New Gamboge as well, which is more in the middle section. And I'm going to use the quill to do the serrations of the leaves as well. It's got a wonderful point, that brush, so that's perfect for serrations. And then while I'm in there, some of the Deep Scarlet will go on there as well while this is still wet. And that will mix in with the New Gamboge to do that sort of golden, muted golden color that I have on here. And I'm making it paler with more water where it's going to merge into the green. Then while that's still wet, I'm going to introduce the green, which is the Cascade Green. And then going back to my New Gamboge, I want to mute that green and make it more yellow. And that's going to mix directly on the paper in the wet in wet. And I must say that that paper is taking the wet in wet washes very well. That's not a given. Some papers do better than others with wet in wet. That Stonehenge paper is taking the wet in wet very well. I'm finished with the wet in wet on a leaf, so now I'm going to use the smaller brush in the box, which is also a Jackson series 561. It's a brush called Kite, and that's a number 1, so it's a lot smaller than the one I've been using, and I'm going to use that for detail. So I've got my raw umber here, and I am going to do the veins. Starting with the central one, and this time I'm working on dry. I have finished the leaf. I added a few blemishes with a mix of raw umber and some of the green in it. The paper handled both the wet in wet work and the dry brush technique, and also it lifted really well as well, which is quite good for beginners. And one of the reasons that it lifted so well is because it's got a little bit of a tooth to it. It's a textured paper. It is a cold pressed, which is a lot more forgiving for beginners than a hot pressed would be, but also allows more detail work than a rough paper would. As far as the brushes are concerned, I really like the quill. I don't normally use quill brushes because I found they don't normally have a good spring, but this one has a very good spring for a quill. So I'm going to be off to Jackson's Art Supplies and I'm going to order myself a couple of those. I really liked the fact that it carried a lot of water, that it came to a good point, and that it had that spring. The small one, the kite brush, also has a good spring and an excellent point. I was able to do all my details with that, so that's a good brush as well. The paints worked beautifully. Daniel Smith's extra fine watercolors, really you can't get any better quality than that, so it's great that Jackson's included those in the set. As for the little palettes, you can see how small they are. They both fit in my hand. This one I just used to pour the paints in, and this one to mix, and that was enough for that kind of subjects. Etcher is a good brand as well. They're not only vegan, they're also a very ethical brand, so I'm very happy to work with that as well. And the fact that the palette fits in a tin as well is really practical and a nice thing to have in my paint set. I'm also quite intrigued by the neutral tint because I never use black pigment, so I wanted to paint this very quick monochrome landscape, which is a view of Loch Ness from the Abbey Grounds in Fort Augustus looking towards Inverness. I wanted to try landscape painting because I really wanted to drench the whole paper, the whole block, to see if it would resist buckling, and it completely did. There is no buckling at all. And I used a quill for painting this, and I really drenched it, so the Stonehenge paper resisted the buckling very well. It didn't dry too quickly, so it gave me time to work my wet on wet washes. And the quill brush was perfect for that because it carries a lot of water and it also carries a lot of paint. The neutral tint, which I was quite curious about, didn't give any texture even when it was very diluted. It painted a very smooth grey, which was actually quite luminous for a black pigment. That surprised me. And when I used it drier to do the trees in the foreground, it handled like painting with ink. And all in all, I actually quite enjoyed working with it, so I might have to revise my opinion of black pigments. I still wouldn't use them in botanical. I don't think they're good for botanical. But when painting landscapes, I'm going to explore that neutral tint a little bit further, as I was quite happily surprised by it. Here we are, I've done my paintings. I have told you what I thought about the materials in the set. Altogether, I do recommend the set. There's loads of really good things in there. I would personally add a couple of colors to have a complete palette. Then again, I'm very fussy about my pigments. I hope the video was useful, and I'll see you soon in another video in Atelier Sandrine Maugy. Happy painting, bye!